Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that buying your favorite American-made sneakers in Canada just got a lot more expensive. That's basically what's happening right now, but on a massive scale, except it's not just sneakers. It's cars, food, electronics, and so much more. Over the weekend, President Donald Trump threw a huge wrench into global trade by slapping big taxes, called tariffs, on goods coming from Canada, Mexico, and China. These tariffs are extra fees that businesses have to pay when they bring products into the US from these countries. And we're not talking about small change here. For Canada and Mexico, the new tariffs add 25% to most of their products entering the US-China, on the other hand, faces a 10% hike. That means if an American company wants to buy something from these countries, they'll have to pay way more than before. Trump says this is all about fixing unfair trade practices and cracking down on illegal drugs crossing the border. But not everyone agrees. In fact, this move has set off a chain reaction, and the world isn't staying quiet about it. Not long after, Canada fired back. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wasn't about to let this slide. He immediately hit back with tariffs of his own, matching Trump's 25% on about 155 billion Canadian dollars, roughly 116 billion US dollars worth of American goods. And it's not just the federal government getting involved. Provinces like Ontario and British Columbia are stepping up with their own countermeasures. Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, wasted no time ordering liquor stores to pull American-made wines, beers, and spirits off the shelves. That's a huge deal, considering Ontario alone imports nearly $1 billion worth of booze from the US every year. Ford also hinted that more drastic steps could be coming, possibly affecting US businesses operating in Canada. Meanwhile, British Columbia's response took a more political turn. Premier David Eby announced that liquor stores would stop purchasing alcohol from US states that support Trump's tariff policies. In other words, if a state backed Trump's move, British Columbia won't be buying their alcohol. At the same time, Mexico made it clear it wasn't backing down either. President Claudia Sheinbaum didn't immediately release a full list of countermeasures, but pledged that Mexico would respond in kind. Mexican officials also pushed back against Trump's claim that their country hasn't done enough to stop illegal drugs from entering the US, pointing out how both nations need to work together to tackle the fentanyl crisis. Over in China, the response was just as strong. Instead of rushing to impose new tariffs, China's government took a different route, threatening to take legal action at the World Trade Organization. So far, China hasn't announced specific new tariffs, but its message was clear: it won't let this slide without a fight. Now, with Trump's tariffs officially taking effect at 12:01 a.m. on Tuesday, there's little time left for last-minute negotiations. But with tensions rising, retaliations piling up, and billions of dollars at stake, the big question remains. To start, British Columbia is looking at ways to make American tech and entertainment companies feel the pressure. One idea on the table: higher taxes on US-based streaming services and digital platforms. The goal isn't just to collect more money, it's to encourage Canadians to use homegrown alternatives. At the same time, the province is shifting its focus toward boosting agricultural and seafood exports to Asia, finding new trade partners in case its relationship with the US takes a serious hit. Meanwhile, Nova Scotia is taking a more hands-on approach. Premier Tim Houston has announced that tolls for US commercial trucks will double, making it much more expensive for American transport companies to use Nova Scotia's highways as a trade route. On top of that, the province's liquor stores will stop selling US alcoholic beverages entirely by February 4th, adding to the growing list of American products disappearing from Canadian shelves. Quebec, on the other hand, is playing a long game. Rather than simply raising tariffs, Premier François Legault has ordered a full review of all government contracts involving American suppliers. If a company is tied to US trade policies that hurt Canada, Quebec might just cut them off. To make up for any losses, the province is looking toward European and Asian suppliers in key industries like pharmaceuticals and construction. To support local businesses that could be affected by these changes, the government has also set aside funding to help companies move away from relying on American raw materials. Further north, the Northwest Territories is taking a different route by focusing on self-reliance. Premier R.J. Simpson has made it clear that his government wants to reduce purchases from American companies wherever possible. This push for economic independence is especially important for remote regions that rely heavily on imports from the US. To fill the gap, the territory is looking to strengthen trade ties with indigenous businesses and Arctic nations, making sure local communities have the resources they need without depending too much on their southern neighbor. All of these provincial moves tie into a much bigger national strategy. Starting February 4th, 2025, the Canadian federal government will roll out a 25% tariff on $150 billion worth of American goods. The first wave, covering $30 billion in imports, will focus on everyday consumer products like drinks, beauty supplies, and paper goods. While each province is tackling the issue in its own way, they all share a common goal: pushing back against US trade policies while protecting their economies. No one really knows how this latest trade battle between the US and Canada will shake out, but one thing is clear: it's getting more intense by the day. A few hours after Canada hit back with its own set of tariffs, President Donald Trump took to social media with a series of bold and unexpected claims. In his usual fiery style, he not only slammed Canada's trade policies, but revived an old, dismissed idea that Canada should just become part of the United States. His post didn't hold back. He argued that without American support, Canada wouldn't survive as an independent country. He claimed the US has been pouring hundreds of billions into keeping Canada afloat while getting little in return. And according to him, it's time to rethink the relationship. If Canada were to become America's 51st state, Trump insisted, it would mean lower taxes, stronger military protection, and most importantly, an end to tariffs. He painted a picture where Canadians would benefit from the economic muscle of the US, while Washington would no longer have to deal with what he described as unfair trade policies. The response from Canada was swift and sharp. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau didn't mince words, calling Trump's suggestion completely absurd and an insult to the strong partnership between the two nations. Across Canada, political leaders from all parties united in rejecting the idea, with many seeing it as a deliberate provocation meant to pressure Ottawa into making trade concessions. But this wasn't just a war of words. Trump's trade policy contained a built-in warning. Any country that dared to strike back with its own tariffs could face even harsher penalties. This was a clear message: don't fight back, or the US will make things even more difficult. Despite the warning, both Canada and Mexico showed no signs of backing down. By imposing their own counter tariffs, they made it clear they weren't going to let Washington dictate the rules of trade. Economic experts are already warning that this back and forth could have serious consequences. Higher prices on everyday goods, supply chain disruptions, and economic uncertainty could soon become reality for businesses and consumers alike. As if the situation wasn't heated enough, Trump followed up with another social media blast. This time, he lashed out at major financial publications, accusing them of siding with globalists and foreign governments instead of protecting American workers. He doubled down on his belief that Canada, Mexico, and China have been exploiting the US for years, blaming weak trade policies and unchecked crime. His message to American companies? Bring production back to the US, avoid tariffs, and help rebuild a stronger national economy. He admitted there might be some short-term pain, but insisted it was a small price to pay for long-term economic dominance. But while these economic policies are making waves, it's something else entirely that has people in Ottawa raising their eyebrows: President Donald Trump's latest social media storm. In a series of fiery posts, he suggested that Canada should simply become part of the United States, calling it a cherished 51st state. Now, this idea has been joked about in movies, TV shows, and late-night comedy for years, but hearing it come from a sitting US president, that's a whole different story. Some say it's just political grandstanding meant to rile up his base, while others fear it could signal a deeper shift in Washington's approach to its northern neighbor. Making Canada part of the US would be nearly impossible. Legal experts point out that such a move would require a radical rewrite of both countries' constitutions, not to mention approval from the Canadian people, who, to put it lightly, aren't exactly lining up for US statehood. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was quick to respond, making it clear that Canada's independence is not up for debate. "We have stood alongside our American allies for generations," he said, "but make no mistake, Canada is and will always be a sovereign nation." But behind the social media spectacle, there's a much bigger issue at play, a high-stakes economic showdown. The US argues that these new tariffs are necessary to level the playing field, accusing Canada of benefiting more from the trade relationship than Washington does. Canada, on the other hand, sees the tariffs as an unnecessary and unfair attack on industries that have long worked closely with American businesses. The effects of this trade fight won't just be felt in government offices. American farmers and manufacturers who depend on Canadian materials or export their goods north of the border are already bracing for impact. With Canada and Mexico hitting back with their own tariffs, prices on everyday goods could climb. Consumer spending might take a hit, and businesses on both sides of the border could feel the squeeze. And then there's the bigger diplomatic picture. Even if Trump's comments about annexation weren't meant as serious policy, they could still deepen tensions with one of America's closest allies. Canada is already moving to counter the economic threat, exploring legal action through international trade organizations, and strengthening ties with other global partners. The ongoing trade battle between the US and its closest neighbors isn't just about taxes on goods. It's starting to shake up relationships that have been stable for decades. Experts warn that if this feud drags on, it could create major headaches in areas far beyond trade. Border security, environmental cooperation, and even defense agreements could take a hit. Despite the heated rhetoric, some believe there's still hope for a behind-the-scenes solution. Reports suggest that officials in both Washington and Ottawa are working through quiet diplomatic channels to diffuse tensions. But with no clear resolution in sight, questions remain. Is President Trump's bold talk about turning Canada into the 51st state just political theater, or is he using it to force a quick deal? At the same time, Trump is flexing his executive powers to push these trade changes forward. He's relying on a decades-old law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to justify his sweeping tariffs. This law gives the president broad authority to take economic action during a national emergency. He threatened to use it against Mexico back in 2019 over border security, but backed down after striking a deal. Now, citing economic security, he's using it to justify tariffs on 3 of America's biggest trading partners, arguing that the US has been giving away too much for too long. Meanwhile, markets are reacting cautiously as the scope of these tariffs expands beyond steel and aluminum. This time, the restrictions are hitting consumer goods, agricultural products, and key industrial materials, making them more expensive for American businesses and households alike. With prices on essential goods rising, companies are left with little choice but to absorb the extra costs or pass them on to consumers. This shift is already being felt in industries that rely heavily on global supply chains, with American retailers warning that everything from household appliances to clothing could soon cost more. On the manufacturing side, things aren't looking much better. The North American auto industry, for instance, depends on a tightly connected production network between the US, Canada, and Mexico. With tariffs now affecting crucial components, major automakers like Ford, GM, and Stellantis are voicing concerns that these increased costs could disrupt production and force difficult decisions about pricing and operations. At the same time, American farmers are bracing for another wave of trade. In previous tariff disputes, Canada Mexico, and China responded by slapping their own tariffs on American agricultural products, leading to massive losses for soybean, pork, and dairy farmers. The Biden administration had previously stepped in with billions in aid to offset these losses, and now, under Trump, farmers fear they could once again find themselves caught in the middle of a geopolitical standoff. With economic uncertainty mounting, concerns are also growing about inflation. If higher tariffs continue driving up costs, the Federal Reserve may have to take action to keep inflation in check. That could mean raising interest rates, making borrowing more expensive for businesses and consumers, and ultimately slowing down economic growth. The US economy is already dealing with its fair share of challenges: rising debt, unpredictable job markets, and a public still adjusting to economic shifts. Now, with new trade policies coming into play, businesses and consumers alike are bracing for even more uncertainty. One of the most immediate concerns is energy. Canada has long been a crucial supplier of oil, gas, electricity, and essential minerals to the US. While most imports are now facing a hefty 25% tariff, the White House has carved out a special exemption for Canadian energy, limiting tariffs on these resources to 10%. Officials argue that this adjustment is necessary to prevent gas prices from soaring across the US. However, energy experts warn that even a 10% hike could disrupt major refineries in the Midwest, which rely on steady supplies from Canada with few short-term alternatives. But energy isn't the only area feeling the squeeze. For years, online shoppers have enjoyed a trade loophole that allowed small packages under $800 from Canada, Mexico, and China to enter the US duty-free. That's now a thing of the past. From now on, even low-cost international purchases will be hit with new tariffs, meaning everyday consumers could soon see price hikes on items they've grown used to ordering cheaply online. And while these tariffs have already sent shockwaves through major trade partners, the fine print of Trump's executive orders reveals an even bigger twist: built-in escalation clauses. If Canada, Mexico, or China retaliates with their own tariffs, the US reserves the right to push duties even higher, creating a cycle of tit-for-tat economic blows. With all three countries signaling that they won't back down, industries that rely on stable trade relationships, like manufacturing and agriculture, now face a period of deep uncertainty. But the global stage is watching too. Even though Europe wasn't directly named in Trump's latest orders, it hasn't escaped his attention. The European Union has long run a trade surplus with the US, especially in the auto sector. While no tariffs have been announced against European imports yet, analysts believe it's only a matter of time before Washington turns its focus toward them as well. Looking back, trade tariffs have played a key role in shaping Trump's economic policies. Between 2017 and 21, his administration used them as a tool to push his America First agenda. Initially, this approach brought some benefits, such as renewed focus on domestic manufacturing and increased pressure on countries accused of unfair trade practices. Over time, however, cracks started to show. Higher import costs made it more expensive for US manufacturers to produce goods, while retaliatory tariffs hit American farmers hard, cutting into their profits and forcing Washington to step in with financial aid packages. Meanwhile, Wall Street struggled to make sense of the shifting trade landscape, leading to market volatility that left businesses uncertain about the future. Now, with the latest round of tariffs covering three of America's biggest trading partners, responsible for nearly half of all US imports, economists fear that the impact could be even greater. If costs rise sharply, businesses hesitate to invest and foreign markets respond in kind, the ripple effects could reshape global trade in ways no one fully expects. What do you think will happen next between Canada and the USA? Let us know what you think in the comment section.